Hello, Commanders, and welcome to my first attempt at a Warhammer episode. I mentioned at the start of the year I wanted to do some of these, maybe put out some painting videos and stuff, and being reminded by my phone that, hey, Chris, it's 30 minutes to midnight and you haven't put out an episode because you're trying to do this every 2 days and you're going to stick to that, right? I thought, better put down my paintbrush because I am a Warhammer nerd, and I am creaming through armies at the moment. Specifically, a fully 3D printed Averland Empire army for the old world. So I thought to myself, how do I actually talk about Warhammer on a audio medium when it's very much a visual spectacle? You see the beautiful yellow uniforms of my Averland infantry marching across a plain with the sound of cannons firing in the distance and the crackle and pop of musketry firing at point blank as barbaric orcs charge into serried ranks of bayonets, blades and halberds as the men of the Empire defend their right to live in the name of Sigmar. And I really should have written that down and submit that to GW, because what I actually wanted to talk about is a tournament I organised, actually. A local friendly tournament I organised, but we did at the tail end of 2024, and I thought, you know what, being told about how a battle went and what kind of lists we're fighting, it might be interesting for Warhammer players amongst you. And if you are a LARPer but not a Warhammer fan, then I'm sorry, this episode really isn't for you. But I do apologise, and there will be more stuff for the LARP scene, especially around Menhir's Fate, coming out very soon. And I say this after looking at a particular post on Facebook, which is asking, why is the LARP community so toxic? To heavily paraphrase it, and the comments, lots of them very well thought out, very interesting, around creative communities and maturity, and in some cases how people just avoid, let's call it, friction-filled topics entirely when they're at these kind of public events. But that's an episode for another time. We're talking about Warhammer. So let's talk about this particular tournament. So I'm quite lucky in that not only do I have friends, I have friends who like Warhammer. And they also like the old world. So those of you who played Fantasy back in the day, you know exactly what we're talking about. For those of you who don't, effectively it's Warhammer Total War, but on the tabletop. If you don't know what Warhammer Total War is, it's a Total War game based in the Warhammer universe. And if you don't know what that is, refer back to the part where this isn't the episode for you. But anyway, I digress. So I've been a huge fan of Warhammer for a long time. From a gameplay perspective, I actually was I much preferred the 41st Millennium. I've been an Imperial Guard player since I was 8. And I vividly remember using a kitchen knife, a blunted kitchen knife, to actually get the pieces off the sprue rather than clippers, using plastic glue to stick large clumps of static grass to their bases, and thinking that dry brushing was an elite skill that I couldn't do, and just slopping paint onto these horrified guardsmen. And I had hundreds of these bastards. I was relentless, and I was fully sold on the ideas that I saw in the Codex back in the day, and fell in love with the wider system, and that love grew and grew and grew. But the game started to get a little bit naff round about 6th edition when I stopped playing. And at that point, my mates were like, well, why don't we just try fantasy? And one of them, a dear friend of mine called Keelan, was an avid fantasy player, had multiple armies, and again, lucky in that respect, and got us into what I think is my favourite tabletop game of all time. Now, don't mistake that for being a good system. It takes a long time to play a battle. You have to meticulously build and paint each individual model, build those up into regiments, get your points right, and understand and learn a lot of universal special rules to make them operate on the tabletop. And there are other games like 5 Leagues from Home, 5 Parsecs. You've got Frostgrave, Stargrave, plenty of others that get a cool fantasy or sci-fi war game, which are phenomenal rule sets. You can play a game in 40 minutes and get a lot of cinematic excitement from doing so. Warhammer is the same, but it takes longer. But there's something about it being chunkier, meatier, grindier. Making these lists, a lot of my group, my Warhammer group, we just share lists with each other, and it's not about making the best list. It's about making themed lists, or where do we put 5 points when we've got 2,000 to spend? And it's that depth of detail that Warhammer tolerates and almost encourages that drew me in. But anyway, I digress. Our dear friend Keelan got me into it, and at this point in my life, I was just about to start working at Games Workshop for a few years in Kingston, and in this position of power, I abused it quite aggressively to get people into Warhammer, especially newer players who were looking at either 40k or Warhammer to start with, and I would heavily influence that decision towards what I wanted to see played in the store. And we started to generate a pretty damn good community, if I say so myself. And that has led on, and now that we are literally a decade away from what I just told you about, I no longer work at Games Workshop, but I have still retained the friends who enjoy the same hobby. So we thought, hey, we play each other on a casual basis, but there's a lot of shit talk. There's a lot of us weighing each other up against the others, comparing our win rates, complaining about the luck of dice, and we thought, why don't we just sort it out? Let's do a tournament. We've been talking about this and texting each other for a couple of years, and we finally bit the bullet and did it. So I am going to run through my list, their lists, and talk you through a couple of games. And this is going to be a high level. This isn't a in-depth review. I won't pretend that we're good or competitive player. Well, we're certainly competitive, but we don't play good lists. Those things are often conflated in the competitive scene, in the tournament scene. But we had a tournament that we wanted to win, but we weren't winning at all costs, otherwise known as whack. So, I have quite a few armies. I've got Empire, as we talked about at the start. I have got Wood Elves, which for me, my favourite fantasy trope is a Wood Elf with a longbow. I adore it. Lightly armoured archers, elite archers, just really tickles something in my brain. I've got Warriors of Chaos because it was the first army I ever picked up, and purely because they were easy to paint and you didn't need as many models back in the day. I was trying it out, but on top of the very basic and sort of points-heavy infantry, they've got some wonderful monsters, and it was a fantastic starter army to get me hooked. But then, for this time round with the Old Worlds, I picked up Vampire Counts. And now these fuckers, back in being an 8-year-old and painting hundreds of guardsmen, I thought I've done it. Nothing could ever break me again. 50 models doesn't intimidate me anymore. Oh boy. Vampires. So I don't like zombies. I approached my Vampire Count army with the idea of it being a zombie, an undead king of old, like a tribal leader, a tribal king, who's resurrected his own comrades, his old personal bodyguard, his huskarls, and the peoples of his villages, and he's formed a legion to take his vengeance upon the living, as an example. So I set to work 3D printing, admittedly. I did cheat a little bit, but 3D printing and painting 250 skeleton warriors. Because in this tournament I thought everyone's going to have good units. We've got Dark Elves, we've got 2 Bretonnia players, we've got a Dwarf player, and we've got a Tomb King player. And I thought, individually, match to match, the trope, the undead are weak individually but great in hordes. I thought, what if I just push that to the max? And I got some fantastic models that it's just bone, a sword, a shield. There's no scraps of cloth or armour on them. They're as basic as you can get. Stormed through them with an airbrush, and there you go, 250 skeletons. Some are grave guards, which are more elite skeletons, and then I took my time and really enjoyed painting up some of the more wacky and wild creatures in the Vampires roster. So I've got some Vargulfs and some Vargeists, which are, imagine a vampire that's just gone feral. They don't even pretend to pass as human anymore. They've swollen into human bat hybrids, and they're utterly insane, running about on the battlefield, murderizing the shit out of things. Love it. As close as you can get to sort of werewolves for that particular list, I would say, with how some of the models look. Yum, yum, yum. Very nice. And then, of course, Warhammer is very much a characterful game, so I got to make my old vampire count. So Idle the Unfallen was the working title, and it does change every single time I'd say his name. But for Grenfell the Fallen, his idea was that original king, so he's sort of clad in armor, very much a combat character, and the idea for the army was broadly set up a wall of skeletons across the entire board, push them into the enemy, and let them die slowly enough that the actual elite infantry and my vampire, who's an absolute combat powerhouse, can pick something in their line, I tried to say burst, and I said bast. I mean burst through the enemy lines, or maybe punch through some of their most hardy units, and then break them, and then start attacking the flanks. All whilst the Vargeists and the Vargulfs, which are the feral vampires, while they all hang around in the back and they act a bit like a quarterback or a fullback. If something goes wrong, they're there to plug the gap. I've got a cool little wizard, called him Twitchy Dave, who was there to do the magical support and resurrecting the dead. Classic evil necromancer vibes. And otherwise, the list was pretty much done. So very infantry heavy. There's better ways to play vampires, but like I said, we're competitive, but we're not winning at all costs. So we have Edel's The Unfallen's Skeleton Legion, and against us in game number 1 is my mate Ben with his host of Dark Elves. So we've got some Corsairs, we've got a Hydra, we've got some Spearmen, crossbows, a set of Blackguard as well, a Lord on a Dragon, and a Sorceress on a Pegasus as well. So a decent list, punchy infantry, nice and quick, and very mobile with the Dragon and the Pegasus in there. And it's the game deployment where we deploy in a diagonal line, only 6 inches away from each other. So diagonal line down the centre, and it's set up to be pretty much a bloodbath from the get-go. And it was. It was a slow, long, grindy fight. The dragon was an absolute nightmare to deal with. It absolutely tore apart the Vargeists and the Vargulf. It just hunted them down and whacked them. I did, however, have a fantastic scenario where we actually managed to... The dragon charged the Vargulf. The Vargulf died, but the dragon didn't overrun. It elected to reform. And I managed to hit it with Erdelvern the Unfallen's unit of Graveguard. And we slam into him. The dragon tortures a bunch of them. Erdel gets his swings back. And then, somehow, I managed to win on the combat resolution. After we worked it out, I won enough to actually force him back. And because you can't use your fly rule, you can't fly when you're falling back from the opponent, apparently, he had to go sort of the long way around a rock, because this particular rock was infinitely tall, which meant that it took loads of movement to do so, and it was easy for my troops to run down the dragon, drag it to the floor, and kick the shit out of it, and the elf bastard on top. And it was this swinging point where the game started to turn around. The Graveguard started to roll up the flank, and pretty much what the intention had been from the game plan was able to actually follow through. So in the end, it was a narrow victory, I think by only 102 points. Anything 100 points or less is considered a draw. So it was 0.1% margin for a win, but still a win. So we'll take it. And, you know, literally any point during the game, if a couple rolls had gone differently, Ben would have won, or it would have been a draw. So a really good game, and very good for the spirit of the game. We often argued with each other over whose rules was correct, and who got the most advantage from it, and we were very generous with each other. And if any of you know Nigel Stillman, he's or Stillmania lists. It's a way of playing the game that you just Google it, and there's a really good photo sort of summarizing his personal rules, and it's all about the character of your gameplay, but also the character of your army, and sticking to that, and almost playing it like an RPG where you are the commander and these are your troops, and they will go with you through thick and thin and all battles between you and your ultimate goal, whatever that might be. And I've been trying to lean into that a bit more recently, and so has Ben, and it was very fun. So game 1 against the Dark Elves, a very narrow victory. Game 2 is against my mate Keelan, that I mentioned earlier. So Keelan is a very good player. He's been playing for the longest out of us. I'd say I'm the second longest, and there is a point of deep contention between us over who was the better player back when 8th edition Fantasy was still available and played, so prior to it getting turned into AOS in 2015. I was extremely angry and cross about that decision from GW, but I've mellowed out over time, and now that everyone has the toys they want, we can all get along. Enough said on that. Keelan and I, at the end of 8th edition, we had a best of 3 to decide who was the best fantasy general. And the point of contention came from me winning 2-1. But one of those games, he had to surrender in turn 2, simply because everything that could have possibly gone wrong with his magic went wrong. And whilst you could argue that's just very unlucky, it certainly didn't feel like a good representation of the game. It's an easy win for my High Elves against his Warriors of Chaos. Oh yeah, I forgot I did High Elves as well. Crikey. There we go. There's 5 armies under the belt. But anyway, I digress. Keelan's out for blood at this point. He has got a grudge to settle, nearly a decade in the making. With his Bretonnian list, he's got a Baron on Pegasus, some Pegasus Knights, a couple units of Knights of the Realm. I think one's Knights Errant and one's Knight of the Realm. A big block of Peasants, a Trebuchet, and a unit of Skirmishing Bowmen. And promptly beats the ever-living shit out of me. Now, this mission was capturing a watchtower in the centre of the board, so there were a decent amount of victory points associated with it, and I thought, crikey, at this point I'm getting turned over. It's time to push hard for it. So skeletons are getting knocked to pieces left, right and centre, and I start to push towards the middle of the board with what I've got left of my elite infantry after they had a successful but Pyrrhic victory against some of his infantry, and the rest of my left-hand side of the board is just getting absolutely mown down. And of course, again, the Vargulf and the Vargeists are torn apart by the Baron on Pegasus. However, it is Erdelgrund the Unfallen that conquers the tower by himself, standing atop the battlements at the end of turn 6. And as we calculate the Fallen and the damage we've done to both sides, what had turned from a crippling loss in turn 4 turned into a solid victory for yours truly. And that was purely with the additional 300 points that Erdelgunk had earned by taking the tower, and also what his elite guard had done to destroy one of Keelan's sort of core main infantry units. Dismounted knights, very point intensive, had loads of banners inside them, and routing them and keeping my skeleton units alive even though they were battered meant that he didn't score the full points for them. So even though another turn the game was over, I did the right amount of damage at exactly the right amount of time and pulled it. And I've never seen a man's face crumple so forcefully. And the first words out of his mouth were, "I've snatched defeat from the jaws of victory." So far, 2-0. Very happy with my games, and very, very happy to put another dent on Keelan's ego. Game 3 is against my friend Aaron, who is new to Old World, and he's playing Tomb Kings because they're an intro faction, they're quite good, and because skeletons are relatively easy to paint, it was a win-win-win for him all round. So he's got a very conventional Tomb Kings list. You'd see it in a tournament. There's his Tomb King itself on a zombie dragon, well, an undead dragon, a bone dragon, if you will. The Tomb Kings, if you don't know, are almost identical to vampire counts, but Egyptian flavoured, and they're allowed ranged weapons, and we're not, which is fine because we get bats, which are pretty cool. Anyway, he's got a bone dragon with the actual Tomb King on top, a Lich Priest, very much like my Necromancer, to hold everything together. He's got a big block of archers, big block of spearmen, big block of Tomb Guard, which are like the elites I use on my side, the Grave Guard, so almost identical in name and purpose. He's got a Necrosphinx, which is an animated sphinx. It's fucking nasty. It's got wings and it flies somehow. And then he's got a fucking Casket of Souls. And for those of you who know those things, it's basically an altar, and the spells it can cast and the area of effect, so the AoE it has, is just nightmarish. So something like -1 to hit doesn't sound like a big deal, but when in a game of D6s, -1 is a big deal, and he had it all over his army. And to be fair, Aaron wasn't technically castling. He wasn't hiding in a corner in a impenetrable hedgehog formation, but he was castling in the middle of the board. So he was against the edge of the board in a horseshoe shape, with his casket in the middle, daring me to come for him. So I came for him, and I have never seen such a large combat ensue in this game. We had a total of 9 units in one long linked combat in the middle of the board. In this game, it's usually 1 unit versus 1 unit. There might be a second, unit. The reason it's called rank and flank is a ranked unit charges another ranked unit and holds them in place, and then another unit, like cavalry, goes around the flanks and hits them in the flank and destroys them more easily. A story in war as old as time. But with undead, they don't break, they don't run, there's no morale mechanic for them. They can crumble, but you can... crumbling is sort of crumbling to dust, but you can reanimate them. And as a result, they're very hard to move and very sticky. And since we're both playing that faction, and we're both playing defensively at this point... Oh, yeah, crikey, I'm bored even remembering it. We just had long, slow, grinding combat, and the game ends up being a narrow win to Aaron. There's some points of contention around just how well protected the dragon is. We'd had a bit of a gentleman's agreement, if you will, to not bring dragons, but Aaron, being new, brought his anyway, which we all said was okay, and we didn't technically ban them. But dragons are very powerful in Old World. It was very tough to deal with. But disregarding that, I'm now at 2-1. 2 wins, 1 loss. And that ends day 1 of our tournament. Good day. Sort of starting at 9 AM, and we finished up around about 9:30 PM, so it's a solid 12 hours. And, sort of 4 hours for a game. That's pretty good. Maybe 3.5 hours of actually playing, and then some breaks and some chats, and a bit of time for lunch in there as well. Right, day 2, and game 4, which is against my good mate Rami. He's the one hosting us. He's also playing Bretonia, but Rami is a fair chunk older than us, nearly 10-15 years. So he's been in this back since all the metals were metal. So he's got classic Bretonians, classic archers, the same pose replicated 40 times, old trebuchet models, fully metal knights and the like, and a baron on a griffin. Baron on a Pegasus, of course. And is playing a very classic style of, I've lined up my cavalry and I'm going to charge you. And we had a really fun game. Rami is notorious for his exceptionally poor luck. He'll roll 100 dice and at least 50 of them will be 1s. And it's consistent, and we've been playing with him for 4 or 5 years at this point now. So when he started to absolutely murderize my units, rolling nothing but 5s and 6s and having a fantastic time against any damage I put into him, he started to utterly crumple my line, destroying units whole-handedly, and not just piecemeal. So I couldn't bring them back. Once the unit's gone, it's gone. And it only took him 3 turns to roll up my entire line, and I think I conceded at that point. We continued the game, but I said, morally I've conceded at this point. And then he proceeded to wipe me off the table by turn 5. So Rami, who maybe wins 1 game in 50, and I'm not exaggerating, has got his first tournament win, and it's an absolutely crushing one. So very quick game, a very surprising turn of events, and I think frankly deserved, especially with his win record. And overall, great fun, nice and quick game. At this point, we're starting to get a bit tired because we've had 4 games of fantasy in the last 18 hours or so. It's pretty rough. But we're getting there, and this is nice and mercifully quick. And with this loss, unfortunately, it does push me out with 2 losses and 2 wins from the top spot. So I not switch off to say, but the pressure is off. There's no longer an opportunity to win, and that is firmly between Aaron and Keelan. So, of course, they have the final game between each other, and they're playing for first place. And long story short, Keelan does end up going 4-1, so he does win the tournament, with Aaron coming second. But who comes third is currently a 3-way tie between myself, Tom, who I'm about to play, and Rami as well, because Rami beats Ben. Ben unfortunately gets the wooden spoon, but we'll talk about the awards later, and it's not as bad as it sounds. So, with Tom was playing dwarves, and I have as a high elf player, as an elf fan, and as a dwarf hater extraordinaire, I was keen to get some blood. But at this point, Slayers had just been released, and also Doomseekers, which are units where rather than giving you points when you kill them, you have the points for them, but if they die, you don't get the points for them because they're so keen to die. And I thought to myself, well, he's slow. He's on 2 short little legs. I'm also quite a slow army, and all I need to do is leave his Doomseeker alive and kill 1 small unit, and I'll have the technical margin to win the game. And as part of this tournament, we were monitoring points, so this was a risk at this point, because if we went in and we drew, but I scored lots of points, it might put me in a third place first rather than third place third, if you see what I mean. We were looking at win-loss, and then any draws we were going to differentiate on number of points. But I thought, well, I need the win here to go 3-2 rather than 2-3. And what I proceed to do to him is nothing short of cruel, where I've got some Vargeists, and they go out and they murk one of his copters. And his army is quite generic for dwarves. It's a big block of Ironbreakers with a king, a block of Thunderers, block of Quarrelers, a cannon, a bolt thrower, a little bit unusual, but kind of goated, and a couple of copters, and there's one more unit I'm forgetting. I think he brought an organ gun as well, so three pieces of artillery. And he's at the back of the board, but the thing is with his artillery, he can kill my models all he wants, so I can just resurrect them. He will never totally kill a unit in a single salvo. So as his copters come forward, he's not clocked onto what the strategy is just yet. The Vargeist run out, take a big risk, tear the shit out of these copters, and then get blasted to pieces in return by the cannons, the Quarrelers, and the Thunderers. And by the grace of the vampires, Erdovongul the Unfallen is counting his lucky stars, because the Vargeists don't die. There's 1 model left with 1 wound. The final stage before total death. So in my turn, they fly back to my lines, I get them healed up, and then they spend the rest of the game hiding. And then at this point, I start to move my models back. Instead of advancing forwards, they slide rearward. And he's thinking, well, he says to me, are you pussying out? What are you doing? And at this point, I say, I'll give you a turn to work it out, and let's see what happens. And then as soon as I say that, thinking I'm being all coy, he goes, oh, shit. Oh, I see what you're doing. That is scummy. That is cowardly and scummy. And he realises that we're at the point now where he may or may not reach me, and that margin for error is a couple of inches on a huge 6x4 board. So he starts to run at me pell-mell. I just back my units off, and we actually have a very quick game. It's over in 35 minutes. And that is because I'm glad to tell you, dear listeners, that I successfully avoid combat with all of his units for the rest of the game. I leave his Doomseeker well and truly unscathed, and on the final turn, just to seal the deal, because we worked it out, it actually would have been a draw. I ended up losing some Warhounds sort of halfway through, and that would have put us in a technical draw. But his cannon fires in fury, and despite its best efforts, blows up. The dwarf cannons are well crafted. He's got magic items on there to stop it from blowing up, like a double resistance to it. it does it anyway. Model removes itself, and that gives me the technical win on points. So very happy with myself. I saunter off to get a coffee and a cake and to settle in and watch Keelan and Aaron play out their final game. All whilst enduring the fierce frowned scowls of Tom, as he's not even licking his wounds. He's actually unscathed, but left with another grudge in the book. So that brings us to the end of the tournament. In first place, we did have Keelan, who won a fantastic golden statue. Second place, we had Aaron with a gold spray-painted horse-mounted rider, just as a quite literally a runner-up because it's running. Third place, yours truly. Fourth place, we had joint Tom and Rami for that spot, and because I robbed Tom of so many points in our game, Rami actually came fourth. So Tom comes fourth/fifth, and then Ben comes sixth with the wooden spoon. He doesn't get a single win. He gets 5 losses. However, 4 of those, including the game I had against him, are only a few points away from draws. And when we're actually watching the games he was playing, every single time it was just a couple of dice rolls where the game could have totally swung in his favour and he could have got the win, especially against Aaron, who was in second, and also against Keelan and myself. So against all the top 3, he just literally any other scenario it would have been a draw or a win to very much upset the rankings. So there you go. That is my first attempt at a Warhammer episode and a tournament analysis, no less. We are going to be starting to try and get another one organised for 2025 towards the end of the year. We've got a good friend Reese who's now moved to London, who's a Skaven and Dwarf player, so he's going to be joining us, and I'm sure we'll pick up some others on the way as well. But until then, dear listeners, thank you so much. If you hate this, tell me. If you like it, tell me. I really don't know how it's going to be received. I'll see the total number of listens over time, but if it's really low, then I'll assume that this kind of stuff sucks. But that will take weeks, so if you don't want me to make another Warhammer episode, tell me it sucks. That said, may the Lords of the Night bless you with the blood kiss, and I'll see you on the next episode. P.S. Nosferatu is a film. Fucking rocks. Watch it. Go see it. Absolutely great. 10 out of 10 vampire vibes. Bye!